The subcommittee on Europe of the House Foreign Affairs Committee will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss U.S. policy towards Europe and NATO, as well as U.S. and allied support to Ukraine in advance of the July NATO Vilnius Leaders Summit. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Next month in Vilnius, NATO member states will meet to discuss the greatest and most pressing challenges facing the alliance. With the largest land war in Europe since World War II ongoing, a rising and increasingly aggressive China, and Finland and hopefully Sweden joining the alliance, there will be no shortage of issues to discuss. There's strong bipartisan support in Congress for NATO. For decades, NATO has served as a cornerstone of American national security and has underpinned our relationship with our closest friends and trade partners in Europe. All of us in this room remember when NATO allies came together in America's defense in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, which was the first and only time that NATO's Article 5 was ever invoked. On Ukraine, I firmly believe that NATO allies must leave the summit in Vilnius with a clear path charted for Ukraine to join the alliance once conditions allow. I am concerned by reporting that the U.S. and Germany are resistant to the alliance making a stronger political commitment to Ukraine, one that is 15 years overdue. At the 2008 NATO's Leaders Summit in Bucharest, all NATO allies agreed that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. Since then, NATO has only repeated that vague promise again and again. In that time, we've learned that NATO's waiting room is not a safe place to be. Ukraine has repeatedly suffered overt and covert aggression from Russia, now including a full-scale war of national survival. Eventual NATO membership is the most solid guarantee against future Russian aggression. Providing a clear path to that membership will signal to Vladimir Putin that he will not be able to achieve his goals in Ukraine on the battlefield. This is critical to prove to him that Russia cannot outlast Ukraine's backers, nor determine the sovereign foreign policy decisions of its neighbors through war. Until Ukraine is a full-fledged member of NATO, it will require concrete security guarantees to help win the current war and deter any future Russian aggression. I believe the United States must be actively involved in these discussions, but implementing such guarantees will require Congress to appropriate the necessary funds. As such, the administration must engage with this committee and this chamber on strategy to allow us to conduct our constitutionally mandated oversight responsibilities. Importantly, like with Israel, the guarantees under the consideration will include continued and reliable security assistance for years to come to ensure that Ukraine can deter future Russian aggression. Therefore, I'm glad to have DAS Cooper here to discuss the weapons Ukraine needs not only to defeat Putin's invading forces, but also to ensure that we don't have a repeat of 2014 and 2022 once Putin's regime rebuilds its forces. In addition, I hope to hear from both of our witnesses why the administration has refused to provide Ukraine with critical weapon systems that could make a real difference on the battlefield, like ATACMS and TPICMS. In fact, just yesterday, this committee passed my bipartisan resolution calling for the immediate transfer of ATACMS to Ukraine. I was honored to be joined in that effort by Ranking Member Keating, a true ally in this fight. Beyond Ukraine, there's great hope that NATO allies will agree at next month's summit to make a firm commitment on burden sharing, namely by clarifying that NATO's defense spending target of 2% of GDP should be considered a floor and not a ceiling. This 2% target was first agreed to by all NATO allies in the summit in 2014, nearly a decade ago. Yet even as the threats from Russia and China grow every day, there are still far too many NATO allies that fail to meet this target. I expect to hear from Mr. Jones about the U.S.'s plans to press our allies at next month's summit to live up to their commitments and to share the burden of collective security. Speaking of China, the strategic concept that NATO released last year said, quote, "The People's Republic of China stated ambitions and coercive policies challenge our interest, security, and values. It's vitally important that our NATO allies recognize and address the threat posed to all of us by the CCP. Our security will be at serious risk if we allow China to own our critical infrastructure, infiltrate our sensitive industries, and to expand its influence to pursue its malign agenda. Lastly, I hope Mr. Jones today can provide an update on Sweden's efforts to join the alliance. I was pleased that NATO welcomed Finland as its 31st member in April, but Sweden's application has remained stalled for far too long. Turkey and Hungary's stonewalling is deeply concerning, and I hope that they will ratify this very capable partner to join this alliance by the summit next month. I want to once again thank our witnesses for being with us today. And with that, I'll now turn to Ranking Member Keating for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. As has been proven by the bipartisan interested in this hearing, congressional support for NATO and Ukraine remains steadfast. I look forward to continuing to work with you on these issues as we have with the recent resolution. We introduced calling, subject to our own readiness needs, calling for the President to provide ATACMS to Ukraine, which I hope will see the floor soon. I also want to thank the witnesses for your tireless efforts to support Ukraine in their fight for freedom against Russian aggression. Together, along with our colleagues across the U.S. government, you work to provide Ukraine with the military, economic, and humanitarian support they need to win the war and to secure their future. In response to Vladimir Putin's criminal war and illegal occupation of Ukraine, the Biden administration has coordinated more than 50 country response with transatlantic alliances as well, and our own global partners to this effort. Through these efforts, like-minded partners have worked to support Ukraine on the battlefield, providing safe haven for those fleeing violence at home, and also to ensure that vital governmental and community services, from schools to hospitals to their own utilities, can literally keep the lights on. As part of these ongoing efforts, leaders from across the NATO alliance will meet in Vilnius next month to discuss current and future challenges, as well as the steps we must take together to ensure our collective security. One such step, which I believe is vital, is the swift approval of Sweden's ascension into the alliance. Last Congress, I introduced legislation that welcomed the accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO, two countries that have incredible military might and that are interoperable already with our alliance. This legislation passed with bipartisan support, and I'm glad that Finland is now squarely in line for NATO. And today, while I'm encouraged by the Hungarian parliament and the fact that they have scheduled a vote on the matter, I continue to call on Hungarian and Turkish allies to approve their application expeditiously. I hope Sweden's membership will be approved soon to ensure we remain united in our response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. In addition, I believe that NATO members must recommit to increased defense spending in response to Vladimir Putin's increasingly aggressive posturing. Vladimir Putin has already made his imperialistic fantasies known when, in a series of letters and memos exchanged between the U.S. and Russia prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia requested the U.S. prevent further eastward expansion of NATO and disarming of 50% of the current NATO countries' capabilities, and also making direct threats to members of the alliance. We must take these threats seriously to deter Russian aggression. While many NATO countries have succeeded in reaching 2%, we must now view this goal as a floor rather than a ceiling. I also look forward to discussions at the Vilnius summit regarding Ukraine's continued progress towards NATO ascension. Much has already been said and discussed on the topic, and Ukraine has clearly surpassed the security relationship that would traditionally warrant a membership action plan. While discussions are ongoing, I've been clear that after this war is over, Ukraine will emerge as one of, if not one of the strongest, the second strongest, most well-equipped military in Europe. We must show unity at the Vilnius summit, and I remain confident that NATO allies will continue to use the vast resources of our historic alliance to ensure Ukraine's self-defense. The European Union has also stepped up as of May 23rd, providing over $78 billion in financial, military, humanitarian, and refugee assistance. This includes over $41 billion in financial and budgetary support, $18 billion in support of Ukrainian refugees, and over $18 billion in military assistance, such as ammunition, and air defenses, Leopard tanks, and fighter jets. The EU is also currently the largest military training provider to the Ukrainian armed forces and will have trained more than 30,000 Ukrainian military personnel by the end of the year. To conclude, I want to briefly address China and the Indo-Pacific. Having served in the subcommittee for many years now, I've always believed that while Russia poses the greatest risk to our collective security today, in the long term, China represents the great threat to our alliance. We must consider our relationship with China, de-risk wherever possible, and bring critical supply chains back home. We must also invest in our partnership in the Indo-Pacific, providing an alternative, democratic way forward with like-minded partners. Unfortunately, as the war in Ukraine is at a pivotal stage and China prioritizes their foreign assistance budget and increases their diplomatic expenditures by 12% in the coming year, Republican House leadership have proposed a 22% budget cut of U.S. foreign assistance. While I know my Republican colleagues recognize Russia and China as a threat, their budget says otherwise. With that, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us here today in this timely discussion, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Keating. Two quick procedural motions. The first is I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate following all other members in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Second, I would like to welcome the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, who are joining us today. They will participate following all other members in today's hearing. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this important topic. Mr. Douglas Jones is Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the Department of State, and he is joined by Ms. Laura Cooper, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia at the Department of Defense. Thank you both for being here. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your verbal remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow for time for member questions. I now recognize Mr. Jones for his opening statement.
Chairman Kane, Ranking Member Keating, thank you for the invitation to testify and for the committee's support for NATO. Your bipartisan leadership and engagement, including in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, reminds our allies that the United States' commitment to NATO remains robust, durable, and unwavering. Russia's brutal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, following its previous 9-year campaign of aggression and illegal occupation of Crimea, has reaffirmed the critical importance of the transatlantic alliance. It has galvanized Allied unity, driven allies to enhance the defense of Allied territory, and strengthened Allied commitment to the democratic values on which the alliance is built. At the NATO summit in Vilnius in July, allies will take decisions to strengthen NATO across 3 broad areas. I'd like to speak to each briefly. First, we will see in Vilnius a strong, united NATO. Allies will reinforce our unity and resolve to support Ukraine in the fight to defend its sovereignty, territorial integrity, democracy, and the right to choose its own path. At Vilnius, NATO will commit to a package of political and practical support for Ukraine that will build on our bilateral support over the past 16 months. Since February 2022, the United States has provided more than $40 billion in bilateral security assistance to Ukraine. More than 50 other nations, including our NATO allies, acting bilaterally through the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, have provided Ukraine with approximately $32 billion in lethal aid. NATO itself has complemented this bilateral lethal assistance to Ukraine's military with non-lethal support, totaling $82 million, with another $110 million in the pipeline to NATO's comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine. And more support is on the way. Second, NATO will strengthen its deterrence and defense in support of our ironclad Article 5 obligations. Allies are completing the full implementation of NATO's new fit-for-purpose force model to fortify the alliance's readiness, working to deepen defense production, and updating defense plans for all allied territory that will address the heightened threat on NATO's eastern flank and the new land, sea, air, cyber, and space security challenges. The alliance is also working to strengthen the Wales Defense Investment Pledge, which states that allies aim to spend 2% of GDP on defense by 2024. As of today, 8 allies are meeting or exceeding the 2% target. Another 9 are on track to do so by next year. 2023 will mark the 9th consecutive year of defense spending growth in real terms for non-U.S. allies, with more than $350 billion in additional defense spending by non-U.S. allies since 2014. But this is not enough. Allies need to do more, and allies will commit to a new enhanced defense investment pledge in Vilnius. Finally, even as NATO sees Russia as the most significant and direct threat to security, peace, and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area, NATO faces other challenges, the PRC first among them. This brings me to my third point. At Vilnius, NATO intends to strengthen its global partnerships in the Indo-Pacific and the Global South. For the second time, heads of state from Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea have been invited to a NATO summit to coordinate on shared security challenges, including the PRC. At NATO's 1949 inception here in Washington, President Truman called the alliance a shield against aggression. For 74 years, it has proven to be the world's most successful defensive alliance, extending that shield of collective security from 12 to now 31 allies, and soon 32. Having Finland, and hopefully soon Sweden, in the alliance makes it stronger, more capable, and more secure. As we look to the Vilnius summit and beyond to the 2024 NATO summit here in Washington, the power of that shield, providing security to nearly 1 billion citizens of NATO countries, remains as strong as ever. Thank you for inviting me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. I now recognize Ms. Cooper for her opening statement.
Chairman Kane, Ranking Member Keating, members of the committee, thank you very much for this opportunity. At the Department of Defense, I am responsible for policy regarding Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Moldova, the South Caucasus, and Central Asia. Today, I want to focus my remarks on the U.S. policy response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and in particular, our work alongside allies and partners to provide Ukrainian forces with the capabilities and the training they need to defend the Ukrainian people and repel Russia's invasion. Our objective in Ukraine is to ensure the existence of a free, prosperous, and democratic Ukraine that can defend itself and deter further Russian aggression. Ukraine is attempting to liberate its territory from Russian occupation or control, including in the latest counteroffensive. Ukraine is well prepared and equipped. Although the course of war is dynamic and unpredictable, we do have great confidence in the training, capabilities, and preparedness of the Ukrainian armed forces. The security assistance that the United States and our allies and partners have provided is substantial, and those resources reflect the shared interests and values that are at stake. Russia's war of aggression is a clear and present danger, not only to Ukraine, but to the security of Europe and to the basic principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity that uphold global stability. Russia's atrocities in Ukraine are an assault on our common values and our common humanity. In a crisis of this magnitude, one that implicates our national interests and values and those of the larger free world, the United States must lead. When we lead with determination and purpose, our friends also respond. For evidence, consider the collective contributions of the group of 50-plus nations Secretary Austin has assembled in the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. Last week, I joined Secretary Austin in Brussels to participate in the 13th meeting of the Contact Group, where we discussed how we can collectively address Ukraine's priority requirements, both for the immediate fight, but also increasingly for the longer term. All told, we have marshaled over $28 billion in security assistance commitments from allies and partners, including in top priority areas of air defense, armor, and artillery. 9 European countries have contributed more than $1 billion each. You can put these figures in perspective if you consider security assistance to Ukraine as a percentage of GDP. By that measure, the United States actually currently ranks 12th globally. It's also helpful to break down the contributions into categories of capabilities. For example, over half of all the tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles provided to Ukraine are from allies and partners, not from the United States. Over half of the 155 millimeter artillery systems are from allies and partners. Over half of the counter-unmanned aerial system capabilities and about half of the Stingers and Javelin missiles are from allies and partners. Moreover, our allies and partners are having a major impact in training Ukrainian forces. In fact, allies have trained more than 3 times the number of Ukrainian soldiers that the United States has trained. Coalitions of allies are starting to emerge to focus on certain capabilities. For example, Germany and Poland are collaborating to provide Ukraine with Leopard tanks, as well as the training and maintenance and sustainment for those tanks. The Netherlands and Denmark are collaborating to set up training for Ukrainian pilots to fly fourth-generation aircraft. And we're also seeing allies starting to make longer-term commitments. Germany has authorized about $13 billion in support to Ukraine over the next 9 to 10 years. Norway has committed over $7 billion, and Denmark recently announced $3.2 billion. You will see many of these figures in the handout that my team has prepared for you today. Finally, it's important to note the growing collaboration between the United States and partners on industrial production, both to support Ukraine and to replenish our own stocks. But in addition to providing the steady flow of security assistance and boosting industrial capacity, we recognize the importance of prioritizing the accountability of that assistance. To date, we have not seen credible evidence of the illicit diversion of U.S.-provided advanced conventional weapons, although Russia continues to spread disinformation to the contrary. That said, DoD continues to implement adapted end-use monitoring measures in Ukraine to track sensitive U.S. weapon systems and to proactively prevent arms proliferation. And I would be happy to address additional questions on this matter in the discussion. Finally, our ability to provide Ukraine's forces with the capabilities they need now and over the longer term rests on continued bipartisan support from Congress. I am committed to working closely with you to maintain enduring support for this national security imperative.